Coming up next here on the Metal Command podcast, I talk about the upcoming Jack Starr album entitled Out of the Darkness Part 2. I revisit one of my favorite albums of all time, which is called The Power of Inner Strength by a band called Grip Inc. I talk about my favorite Cleveland heavy metal band of all time, named Shok Paris, and I talk a little more in depth about Jon Schaffer of Iced Earth, who had his lawsuit officially dropped not long ago. All of that coming up next here on the Metal Command podcast.
You are listening to the Metal Command podcast.
Greetings and welcome back to another edition of the Metal Command podcast. Tony here with you. Really excited, of course, to be here with everybody today. And of course, if you do like what you hear and see on this podcast, by all means, hit the subscribe button, hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video. And if you follow this show on any other form of social media, by all means, hit the subscribe button or follow button over there. Have a lot to talk about, a lot of really cool stuff to talk about, actually. I'm going to talk about the upcoming Jack Starr solo album called Out of the Darkness Part 2, which features Giles Lavery on vocals and some great songwriting. I'm going to take a trip back in time to an album from the 1990s that is still, to me, probably one of the most incredible heavy metal albums I've ever heard. That would be Grip Inc. with The Power of Inner Strength. Jon Schaffer, of course, from Iced Earth. His lawsuit was officially dropped without prejudice. But first, I'm going to start off by talking about a band from my own backyard. Let's start the show off by talking about my favorite Cleveland heavy metal band of all time, Shok Paris. Now, for those of you that do not know, I am a native of the Cleveland, Ohio area, the greater Cleveland, Ohio area, and frequently I will get emails or I will get messages asking me about bands from my area. Have you had really good bands in your area? Who would you recommend from your area that's good? And what is your favorite band from your hometown? And what is your favorite album ever put out by a band in your hometown? I've actually had a lot of those questions over the past month. And without hesitation, when I answer that question, I say it is a band called Shok Paris, and it's an album called Steel and Starlight, which is right here. A really, really incredible heavy metal album. In fact, I would probably have that album in my top 50 of all time list. Definitely. It is that awesome. It is literally one of my favorite albums of all time, and I could still go and listen to it and not get sick of listening to it. So that is a short answer to a very, very long question. Now, when I was thinking about answering this, I figured, you know what? I think I'm going to go in a little bit in depth about the history of this band, talk a little bit about the Cleveland heavy metal scene, and I'm even going to play some interview clips from people here in the Cleveland metal scene, which I'll get to here in a little bit. And we'll also talk a bit more in depth on the Steel and Starlight album. So Shok Paris was from Cleveland, Ohio. They were first formed in, I think it was like the early 80s. And they ended up getting their start on what was called the Cleveland Metal compilation. And they, essentially had a song on there called Go Down Fighting, which is different from the Go Down Fighting that is on this album. But they are more of a traditional heavy metal band. They had 4 albums. Go for the Throat, which was a great debut album, and Steel and Starlight, which is their second album. And, Steel and Starlight was cool because it was their, major label debut. They went on tour with Savatage that year, and they had a lot of great stuff. They had 2 songs on in a movie soundtrack, a movie called The Hidden, which is a sci-fi thriller. And just a lot of great stuff happened for them with the Steel and Starlight album. Now, they were discovered by the man who founded Auburn Records, Bill Peters. And most people that when you think of Cleveland and you think of the metal scene, almost everybody thinks of Bill Peters, like people outside of, the country even. recognize Bill as being like the godfather of the heavy metal scene in a sense. I mean, the guy has been doing his radio show since the summer of 1982. It's called Metal on Metal, and it's been on the radio for, obviously well over 40 years now at this point, on WJCU 88.7. He's had that same Friday night slot on with that show probably as long as I can remember. But Bill's an incredible guy. He founded Auburn Records. He had some great bands, Shok Paris being one of them. He had bands like Destructor and, Breakers, Get Tough. That was an album that came out on that label, which is an underground cult classic, actually, especially back in the 80s. A great record. A lot of these he ended up reissuing. He put out the first Shok Paris album, Go for the Throat, which I think is an incredible record as well. And a lot of these albums he has reissued over the years and has done some great stuff as well. And then, of course, Destructor, that's a band that's still putting out albums even to this day, and they ended up getting their start on Auburn Records. And Bill discovered a lot of great talent around here in the Cleveland area. So Shok Paris is, to me, probably the quintessential traditional heavy metal band from the Cleveland area. I mean, there are a few others that are good, but they don't play the same style of music. We've had bands like Chimera, or, you had a band like, Mushroom Head, which came from Cleveland, but they don't play the same style of music Shok Paris does. But for me and my preferences, pretty much all of these bands I've named are pretty good, and I do own albums by them, and I like them. But Shok, to me, is a very special band. Now, it's interesting. I'll go into the backstory of how I discovered them before I go into a little bit of a history lesson about the band. So it's interesting. I discovered Shok Paris initially not from anybody living in Cleveland, not from anybody living in the United States. And I want everybody to keep in mind, when I started this show back in 1998, I was clueless as to the history of the Cleveland metal scene. The only thing that I knew at that point in time was I knew Bill Peters had a big part in it. That's it. I didn't really know any of the bands or who they were, or, a lot of them really weren't out playing, tons of shows at that point. I just didn't know. I knew who Bill was. I had heard of the band Mushroom Head at that point, and that was it. I didn't know anything else. But I did not discover Shok Paris from anybody here in the United States. Ironically, and interestingly enough, I first heard of the band from people in Europe. Keep in mind, the Metal Command show started out by me playing a lot of bands from Europe and getting to know and become friends with a lot of these bands. A band that a lot of people know about that I've been friends with for, almost 30 years is Halloween. And the reason I say that is I was having a phone conversation with Michael Wyketh on the phone. In our phone conversations, we'll talk about bands we like. Right now, we'll talk about turntables and stereo equipment and just a lot of really cool stuff, just real life stuff. Wykey and I have always had really great conversations. But I remember one of the first conversations I ever had with him on the phone. We were talking about Cleveland, Ohio. And he had told me that, their first U.S. tour, one of the tour managers was from Cleveland. But then he brings up a band. He asks me this question: have you ever heard of the band Shok Paris? And I was like, no, I've never heard of them in my life. I've never heard of the band. And he was telling me that many years ago, before we talked, in the late 90s, that he was really into this band. It was a band that he really liked. He was telling me about how the guitar player in the band writes some really great riffs. They had great songs. And he mentioned that Vic Hix had a very good Dio-esque sounding voice. It's kind of like his own words. And he was telling me about this band and that I needed to hear an album called Steel and Starlight, and that Go for the Throat was also a very good album. But Steel and Starlight was the album he was referring to, and then, of course, the album after it, Concrete Killers. Anyway, to make a long story short, as soon as he told me that, I'm thinking, I got to hear this band. Wykey's speaking really highly of them. And I went on a quest to find an album by Shok Paris. But unfortunately, it was very difficult to do because back in the late 90s, you had no streaming. You had no high-speed internet. The only way you could hear a band is by finding a physical copy of their music. Now, today, that might seem crazy, but back then, that was the only way you could listen to a new band, was to, sometimes you'd peruse the bargain bin at a used CD place or find a used vinyl of that band's album. But that was the only way you could ever hear them. And so I had a hard time finding anything. Metal was at its lowest point in the United States at that time. So finding anything heavy metal related was really, really difficult. And then as I interviewed other bands from Europe, they would ask me that. I had a couple other bands that were, pretty successful that would bring up the band Shok Paris. And I'm thinking to myself, man, I got to find something by these guys. And folks, I eventually did, because the early days of eBay, I found this copy of the Steel and Starlight album. It's an original IRS copy. And I found a copy of Concrete Killers as well. And I found those two albums. I didn't find Go for the Throat until later on when Bill Peters reissued it. But I ended up finding this album. And the thing is, when I heard the song Go Down Fighting, first of all, instantly I loved it. It's literally one of the greatest heavy metal songs I've ever heard. However, I liked the song so much that I kept putting it on repeat, and I didn't listen to the rest of the album until like a week later. But the album is incredible, to be honest with you. There is not a bad song on it for me. And, it is the ultimate compliment when you have people in bands that are very successful, when they go out of their way to compliment your music or suggest your music to somebody else. When those people were talking to me about Shok Paris, I was like, man, that's the ultimate compliment. And it made me even want to hear them even more. So that is how I discovered the band. Now, Shok Paris has an interesting history behind it. And instead of me telling you the story behind the band and how the band was discovered and how they ended up getting their deal with IRS Records at the time, I figured I would let Bill Peters from Auburn Records and, of course, the Metal on Metal radio show tell you his version of events and how they unfolded and how he discovered the band. So here's an interview clip with Bill Peters. I did this interview with him on my old radio show on WBWC 88.3 back in 2009. He came on my show for the 25th anniversary show of Auburn Records, which was a great show, and I still have that really awesome t-shirt that Bill sold at the show. But this is Bill Peters coming on my radio show to talk about how he discovered Shok Paris and what led up to them getting their deal with IRS Records. Check out this interview clip right here.
Now let's kind of move on a little bit. Shok Paris, and they had moved up pretty high level. I mean, they were on IRS Records for a bit, and after Auburn and everything like that. And talk about how you discovered them.
Shok Paris was actually a band that Shok Paris had many firsts for me, and being in the right place at the right time. That's how I can describe Shok Paris, because they were very fortunate. They got a lot of breaks early on. The way they got on the Cleveland Metal album, we had another artist who wanted to have 2 tracks on the record, and at the time we only had 2 tracks for Black Death. But this artist not only wanted 2 tracks on the record, he wanted the first song on each side. So when this all was going down, I finally said, okay, we'll agree to 2 tracks, but we're not going to give you the first song on each side. That's just not going to happen. So this artist decided not to be on the record because we didn't want to give that. So we had 2 more tracks because we lost the 2 we were going to give him. So we decided to give Breaker a second song on the record, because they were one of the bigger bands at the time, kind of breaking out of the scene, and Black Death. Those 2 bands had 2 tracks on our Cleveland Metal album. Now, we had 1 more spot left, and I asked the guys in Breaker, do you know any other bands? And they said, these friends of ours practice down the street. It was above a doctor's office or a dentist's office. I don't remember. It was like a medical building. So I went down to see them, and they only had 3 songs written. That was it. Run But Don't Hide, Burn It Down, and Go Down Fighting. I thought these 3 songs were amazing, and if you know the first Go for the Throat album I did, those are great songs on that record. But they had a different singer in the band at the time. They didn't have Vic Hix. So they played the only 3 songs they knew. They had never played out live. And we had a meeting. Tim and I were there, and we had a meeting with the band. Now, this medical building they practice, this doctor's office thing, it had different segregated rooms. So when we had the meeting, the band came in the room with us, but the singer waited in another room with the door shut. Okay, I'm thinking, this is kind of strange. Why is the singer in this room and the rest of the band over here? And so they told us. The singer didn't know what we were talking about. Now, we were going to talk to them about being on our record. And the singer was not going to be in the band much longer, but he didn't know it at the time because they told me, well, look, we really want to be on your compilation record. We'll record with him, but we just wanted to tell you up front, we're going to ask him to leave the band right after we finish recording because we need a new singer. We need a whole different direction. So they told me that up front. Now, little did I know at the time is that when the record came out and we took it to WMMS, who still played local music then, what song did they pick to play on the record? They picked Breaker and they picked Shok Paris. Shok Paris was the number 1 track they played. They started playing it in regular rotation, Go Down Fighting. It became a big hit on the record. Shok Paris' very first show at the Pop Shop with Vic Hix was a headlining show. Now here's all the other bands, Breaker and Black Death, all working for years, struggling, opening, building up a following. Shok Paris walks out here. They had 3 songs. They get on a record that we're doing at the last minute by a fluke. They get played on WMMS in heavy rotation. They come out as a headlining band.
Yeah.
So, that's the way it goes, the breaks, and then they end up being the first band that gets signed to a major label.
Awesome. Well, I think I saw a copy of Go for the Throat. Do you have that with you? Or
yeah, I
some
do.
Shok Paris? Yeah, let's play something off that.
Of course, yeah.
Let's play something off that. Definitely. I remember when you reissued this before, and I got it. This is definitely a great disc.
Yeah. I'm very proud of the first record. We recorded it at Sumo Recording. I spent a lot of money on the recording. At the time, again, it was expensive to record records.
Yeah.
But Michael Klein from Breaker, a guitar player, he did the cover art, which is just a guillotine, a simple design. I really like the wood on the guillotine.
Yes,
man, he
definitely.
put a lot of detail into that. But we didn't have digital technology, so he actually painted that. That's an actual painting he did.
Really?
Yeah, for the cover. So I'm very happy with the way the first record turned out. So, Clubside Records in 1983. I'm trying to keep this historically correct here. After the Cleveland Metal album came out, it finished its run, and Tim really didn't have any desire to keep going with the heavy metal stuff and the label. So I wanted to keep doing it. So I left. We split. We didn't have like a partnership anymore. And I decided, I'm just going to keep this going. So I wanted to come up with a new label name because we had used Clubside Records for our joint thing. And, it's hard to come up with a name. You're in a band, Tony. It's tough coming up with band names.
Yep,
it's hard coming up with label names and as well. And I didn't want a label name that was had the word metal in it, like my show, Metal on Metal, or Metal Merchant Records, or something that I just didn't want it to be metal. And a good friend of mine, Patty Van Dusen in Maple Heights, her street was Auburn Avenue. And I had used Clubside Records for the first label. And I don't know, it just hit me. I was trying to think, and I thought, Patty, Auburn. And I thought, oh man, Auburn. Yeah, it's kind of got a cool sound to it. It's got the burn in there, it's got the little metal edge to it, but it's not too metal sounding. It doesn't have that certain cliche metal sound. So it just stuck. I just decided to call the label Auburn Records, and Shok Paris came out. Tim Stewart wanted to continue on and keep learning about this music business, so he managed Shok Paris. I put out the record, and he was the band's manager for a little bit there. So we still got to work together.
Awesome. So let's play a track off this. I haven't listened to this in a while. I was taking out some of this stuff. What track do you think we should play off this album?
Well, I'll tell you what. How about track 6, Caged Tiger?
Caged Tiger.
They're going to play this one live next week.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Yeah.
And we'll be back after this. And that was Caged Tiger off of Shok Paris' debut album, Go for the Throat. And
that song they're going to be doing, I will tell people that they are doing that song next week. For all you diehard Shok Paris fans, that's kind of an obscure song. I mean, not super obscure, but that's one they don't always play live. And when I was announced Shok Paris was playing the show, I couldn't believe I got like about a dozen emails. I swear to God, Tony, people asking, "Hey, are they going to play Cage Tiger?" I was like, "Where are all these people coming from? These Cage Tiger fans?"
Well, if anybody has a question for Bill, you can email the show, officermetal@metalcommand.net, and that's all word. Officer Metal is all one word, so officermetal@metalcommand.net. If you have any questions you want to ask or anything you want to ask, now's the time to do it. You can send me some emails, and then I will definitely ask those to Bill on the show. Now, these guys ended up getting, they had a couple albums after this. Maybe talk about that point.
Yeah, I mean, again, Tony, we talked off the air. The history is so extensive. We could talk for 5 nights about the ins and outs of all this stuff. But I'll try to keep it just simple. I mean, and this is just a basic overview. Shok Paris got signed to a major label, and it was a joint label deal with IRS Records and Auburn Records. I don't think a lot of people actually knew that, but both of their albums were through a distribution deal with myself and MCA. But at the time, what happened was I worked at Warner Brothers, and one of our Elektra Records reps, Barry Lyons, he ended up going over to IRS, taking a job there, and he knew all about my heavy metal label. I worked at Warner Brothers and did my label on the side, and everybody was very supportive of that. In fact, Warner Brothers' very own pressing plant at the time actually did all my pressings. But Barry, when he went over to IRS Records, that label was only really known for the Police, right? REM. I mean, Miles Copeland owned the label, but they were just indie rock. And he wanted to bring heavy metal to IRS Records, which was that was pretty radical back then. So he signed a band from Detroit called Seduce. And he told me, since he knew I had this label, and he liked all the bands I had, he said, "Bill," he goes, "you can give me any band you want." He goes, "Anybody, just give me an album." He goes, "and that'll be our first deal." He goes, "I want to bring one of your bands over here." And at the time, at Masterdisc, I had Tony Dawsey, very famous engineer, if you know anything about mastering. He was actually mastering my 2 albums. And the 2 albums he had at the time were Breakers Get Tough and Shok Paris' Steel and Starlight. And Breakers Get Tough was just, as it turned out to be, just underground classic, a masterpiece. Unfortunately, Breaker had asked Jim Hamar to leave the band. So we were finishing the record, and the band did not have a singer at the time. So I only had one choice I could give him to IRS Records. I told him, "Shok Paris, send it over." And that's how they got to be the first major label band, because it probably would have been Breaker. Breaker had a bigger draw and had been more established at the time, so they probably would have been the first band to get the major deal if they had a singer.
And that is Bill Peters from Auburn Records talking about how he discovered Shok Paris and how they ended up getting their first record deal. And of course, for that tour, I believe for Steel and Starlight, they toured with Savatage as well, which, that would have been during the Hall of the Mountain King album, which would have been an incredible show. Seeing, Savatage in their prime, Chris Oliva, John Oliva in his prime, and then having Shok Paris tour with them, that would have been an incredible show. So, let's talk a little bit more in depth about the Steel and Starlight album, which obviously came out in 1987. This is the second album they put out. Actually, Shok Paris put out 4 records. You had Go for the Throat, you had Steel and Starlight, you had Concrete Killers, and then the most recent one, which came out, I believe, in 2020, Full Metal Jacket. All 4 of those records are good. Steel and Starlight, to me, though, is like that record. Like everybody has a band that, you always have that one album that you always go to by them. If you really like that band, that is Steel and Starlight. Everything about it, the production, the songs, everything about the record is unbelievable. And when I think back on me first hearing this, I can go back and I could still listen to Go Down Fighting, and it's still one of the most incredible songs I've ever heard. However, there's an interesting story about Steel and Starlight. This album has been reissued many times over the years, but the mix that's on here is different from the original mix of the album. So I'll explain here for a second. They had two different mixes because originally, if you listened back to that clip Bill Peters talked about, he sent that album over to IRS Records. That album was already mixed, and they already had a track listing. However, the record company went and remixed it, deleted one of the tracks, and made their own mix of the album. Consequently, not long ago, Bill Peters put out the Auburn Sessions, which is and has the original mix of the album, which I think is 10 times better than the one the record company did on it. I think the record company watered down the album when they went and remixed it. But this is the best mix. It has extra bonus tracks, 4 demos, and there was a song called The Minuteman, which was actually originally deleted off of the album when IRS Records ended up getting to it. But, you know, the best person to tell you that story is not me. It is Vic Hix, the singer of Shok Paris. Vic Hix came on my show back in November of 2012 on my radio show, and we had a long discussion live on the show on a Friday night, I believe it was, and we talked about the history behind this band. And here is Vic Hix telling the story about the second version of Steel and Starlight. Check this out.
One of my favorite albums, and a lot of people, one of their favorite albums, obviously Steel and Starlight, and he ended up getting kind of a major label, some distribution going on with that. And of course, to me, it's the definitive record, in my opinion, that you guys recorded. It's still one of my favorite metal albums of all time. And you know, from the production to the songwriting to everything, the band was just unbelievably killer on that record. And talk about the making of that album. You know, talk about getting your first real, you know, big labeled record deal with IRS, and you know, maybe go from there.
Well, we're talking about the second album and not the first one, right?
Correct.
You didn't know that there was 2 Steel and Starlight recordings.
No, I did not.
A lot of people don't know that. There is. Mr. Bill Peters will someday release that, and it was the way the band wanted the album to sound like, but the record company, and that's okay, that's what you signed the record companies for. The one that you hear now is produced by the record company. There's 2 basic productions of it. If you ever get to hear the first, the band side of it, it's much heavier than the Steel and Starlight you know. So, and that's what happened, basically, and I can't say I wasn't there firsthand because we did all the recordings. Kenny went, and he'd know more, but actually he went to Chicago and they remixed it. But that's what the record company wanted, and there's even a couple songs, like I do believe The Minuteman is one that's recorded that was supposed to be on the album, and IRS, the record company, they weren't too hot about us singing a history song about the Revolutionary War, being that they were somewhat British. Someone in the record company was British and kind of didn't like that. That being said, so so we actually have a song or 2 songs, I think, that no one's ever heard that's recorded.
Mm-hmm.
So one of these days we'll get that out. So going back to the your original question was, when we signed with the record company, that was cool. It was very good. It helped us. It helped everybody. And it actually, I think, helped other bands in Cleveland. It's, hey, anytime anybody breaks out, and what little breakout it was, because remember, it was IRS, which everybody said stands for It Really Sucks. And, you know, it was funny. We replaced the Go-Go's. A lot of people don't know that. That was because IRS, you see everybody jumping on the metal bandwagon. IRS decided to put us on, so they got rid of the Go-Go's. Go-Go's were going out the building while we were coming in. Pretty amazing.
So that interview clip is from November of 2012. That's Vic Hix, the singer from Shok Paris, talking about the 2 different versions of the album. Folks, I could still go listen to any album by this band and really still enjoy their music after all this time. Again, I've had Steel and Starlight. I think I found my copy of it, my first copy, back in, it was 1999. Both of these versions, by the way, have a different track listing. The track listing does alter a little bit. Like on the Auburn Records version, the song Exhibit A is the first song in the album, whereas when I look at Go Down Fighting, it is track 10. But either version is great. If you can find the Auburn Sessions version of this album, get it, because it is that good. Lastly, I'll end it off with this. Something that, sadly, Ken Erb, the guitar player one of the guitar players from the band, founding member of the band, he sadly passed away November 12th, 2023. However, something really cool recently happened, and that is the fact that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum here in Cleveland, Ohio, has his Flying V, his Flying V on display at the Rock Hall, which I think is really cool. And I want to talk about him briefly before I end this off. I thought Ken was an excellent guitar player. The first time I ever saw him play live, because at the first time I saw him play live probably would have been about 2003 or 2004. So it was quite a long time. He wasn't playing with Shok Paris. It was a band called Zone 11. And I remember seeing this band. It was a small club, Brook Park, Ohio, I think it was. And I hear this band, some really cool riffage. Singer was pretty good. I think his name was Ron. And I hear this. Now I'm kind of half paying attention to their set, but then I hear this guitar solo get played. And I see Ken walking up to the front of the stage, playing guitar, playing the solo. Now, I could not tell you what the name of the song was, but I could still hear the melody of the guitar solo in my head, even to this day. And I had no idea he was even in that band to begin with. I just saw this dude come up, play this guitar solo. It completely made me stop what I was doing and watch the rest of this band set. Later on, I learned that was actually Ken Erb from Shok Paris. But the guy had a lot of great riffs. He really, truly was a fantastic guitar player. And when and I would say that about any of the guys in the band, to be honest with you. So when you have musicians from other successful bands, and I want to make this very clear, when they compliment you, when people that are your contemporaries, or when you have other musicians in successful bands complimenting your music, that's like the ultimate compliment. And it says a lot about the music this band put out to have a lot of musicians that I know who a lot of them, when they think of the heavy metal scene in Cleveland, especially overseas, they're thinking of a band like Shok Paris. They are. That's not the only band they think of. Sometimes they get the band Destructor mentioned to me. That's a band that's actually been mentioned quite frequently over the years as well. But when you get people from successful bands, power metal bands, traditional metal bands, talking about how good Shok Paris, actually was as a band, I can tell you that's like the ultimate compliment. And that's honestly, you get a high set of expectations too when you go to listen to their music. And my expectations were pretty high, and the Steel and Starlight album alone exceeded them. So overall, I still have a lot of love for this album. The Auburn Sessions, if you could probably find it on a streaming service somewhere, if you cannot find the physical copy. But I got to tell you, this mix of the album, in my opinion, is a lot better. It's heavier. I like the track listing, believe it or not, a lot better as well. If you could find the CD version, there's actually some liner notes from Mark Groman, who obviously, for those of you that are metalheads, know who he is. He is a writer for Brave Words and has written some great books over the years. But definitely a great band. And again, Bill Peters, who I don't know too well, and I honestly don't even know the guys in Shok Paris that well. But I can tell you that Bill really had a lot of really good bands on the Auburn Records label. And he's a really good dude. If there's anybody out there that is dedicated to this music, like if you're looking for someone that's like the gold standard of being dedicated to heavy metal, Bill Peters would be one of those people. Again, he has hosted his radio show since the summer of 1982. Right now, it is 2025. It's March of 2025. So the guy's been on the air. He still has a passion for doing it. Some of the things Bill has done over the years, such as putting on shows to collect donations, to donate to, like a food drive, either to donate to like animal shelters or, for homeless people. I mean, he's done a lot of really cool stuff and a lot of great stuff for people. And I can't speak any more highly of him at all. I mean, the guy's really cool. So anyhow, that's my favorite heavy metal band from my hometown. It'll probably never change. But the Steel and Starlight album, if you have not checked that album out ever, you should. If you like traditional metal and you like old school sounding metal, I mean, especially from 1987, that production still holds up today, at least in my opinion. Definitely check out the album. So with that said, let's move into the next aspect or the next segment of this podcast. Let's talk about Jon Schaffer from Iced Earth. Recently, Jon Schaffer's lawsuit that was brought against him by the government has been officially dropped without prejudice. And thanks to a lady by the name of Metal Rose from a podcast called Podcast of the Wicked, I ended up getting the court transcripts of that lawsuit and, of course, his court hearing. Like where they sentenced him, all that stuff. First of all, Metal Rose has done an absolutely excellent job at following Jon Schaffer and what has happened with him since, 2021. And actually, all the people on that podcast have really done a great job discussing it. So compliments to her and the folks at that podcast, because they are one of the few people even talking about Jon at this point. Now, for those of you that follow my show, we had a roundtable discussion about Jon Schaffer. We talked about his career and how he could resurrect it. We talked about his situation. We also talked about how he was perceived by people. And we talked about our own experiences. I had Justin Roth come on and Christian Wentz, both very, very cool people, very knowledgeable people. They really are the guys that really helped make that podcast really, really great, and compliments to them. Justin, of course, plays in a band called War Curse, and Christian has some cool stuff coming down the pipe that I can't really tell anybody about yet, but very good dude, very good guitar players, both of them. And we had a roundtable discussion about Jon Schaffer. The reaction to that discussion was a lot better than I thought it would be. I thought the reaction would be good because I think the hatred towards Jon that people had, most of that is gone. However, first of all, I received more messages and emails and comments about that podcast than I have on probably over half the videos on this channel. It was a great discussion. And the reactions were great. And the interesting part about it is that people who were initially angry with Jon and pissed off at him and hated him, a lot of those people were emailing me because I remember them commenting on the Facebook page back when the incident happened in 2021. So the reactions were great, actually. And there really aren't that many people talking about Jon, which I think is odd, which is something I'm going to get into here a little in a minute. But the reaction was good. And our discussion that we had about Jon, I thought was awesome. So, again, we all kind of have the same viewpoint of it. Myself, Justin, and Christian. He made a bad decision, a very emotionally charged decision, fell right into, as Justin put it in the podcast, taking the cheese off the mousetrap. And the only thing he was guilty of was making a bad decision. I mean, I looked at the lawsuit. He's named in the lawsuit, but when I looked at the lawsuit, every page, I mean, that lawsuit was quite a few pages. When I looked at the lawsuit, Jon is like a super small paragraph in that lawsuit. Like, they name all these people and what they did. Jon's like a paragraph that might take up about a fifth of a page, if that. And you know what they talked about? He basically, essentially, when I look at that paragraph, the dude walked into a building with a water bottle and a can of bear spray. He was one of the first people in the building, yelled at some people, and he didn't spend much time there, and then he was out of the building. That's it. Now, I'm looking at this lawsuit, and I'm looking at all these seditious conspiracy charges and all these other people they were naming in there, and these people are like 1 or 2 pages long in some cases. But the page the page that had Jon's name on it, he was in there for like a very short paragraph, and he was a very, very minor part of that lawsuit, actually. So I looked at that, and I'm like, I'm looking at Jon's statement, and he was talking about how he thought he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison, which is kind of scary for walking into a building with a water bottle and a can of bear spray. Anyhow, I'm going to stand by and stick by what I said. And I said this in the discussion. I'm going to put the discussion in the show notes. I said he made a very bad decision. It was probably a spur of the moment decision where he let his emotions get the best of him. And as Christian said in the discussion, nobody probably thought that situation would escalate into the stupidity that it actually was. And he not only screwed himself over out of his career, but he put his bandmates in any musical endeavor he had going on in a bad position, both by either losing income or being associated with him for doing what he did. Now, as I've said in the past, other people have done much worse in the metal scene. For example, think about all the people in the black metal scene that have murdered people. Then you have Vince Neil. Remember Vince Neil back in the 80s? Getting into a car drunk. Somebody gets in with him, gets into an accident, his passenger dies. And then, of course, Justin Roth brought up Tim Lambesis, the guy that hired somebody to give his wife a dirt nap. Among other things he's been in the news for. So if all these other people can be forgiven, I think Jon can be forgiven for walking into a building with a can of bear spray that he didn't use on anybody and a water bottle. And that goes for you people holding on to this notion that Jon is some kind of terrorist or insurrectionalist. Folks, if that was an insurrection, that's the worst insurrection I think I've ever seen. That's not what that was. That was a group of people who made a very bad decision to walk into a building and put themselves in a position to not only be used as political cannon fodder, but to be made an example of. So his lawsuit has been dropped. Now, I'm really excited for the next chapter because I'm going to assume Jon is going to resurrect his career and do something musically. Now, I think his best approach is exactly what Justin Roth said in the discussion. Let me play this clip from that discussion where Justin talks about what he thinks Jon should do or what he thinks he's going to do as far as putting out new music. Check this out.
And I think what's going to happen, if I had to guess, this is my prediction, he's going to rebuild his band. I mean, essentially the band is his songwriting. I mean, there's no secret there. He's going to, whether some of the other guys come back or whether he gets a new group of guys, he's going to very quietly, he's going to negotiate a deal on the side someplace. Now, whether it's with a smaller label or, like I say, I think Napalm's probably a good move for him. He's going to record the music. No one's going to know anything about it, and they're just going to fucking drop a single. It's going to catch everyone off guard. It's going to be like that Poison the Well single that dropped today, and everybody's like, what the fuck? Who saw this coming? That's the move. And then you're going to get to gauge the climate. You're going to see
Yeah.
if people listen. You're going to see what the reaction is. But yeah, I think if I'm him, I work on something, I get it done. I don't say a word to anybody about it. I drop it and I gauge reaction.
I 100% agree with Justin. I think he should get a band together, either release music independently or do a record deal with somebody, not put out any press releases about anything, and out of nowhere, drop a single, engage reaction. That would be the best thing to do. Because the thing is, when you start putting stuff in the press, you're building things up. You are, getting all the haters to come out of the woodwork, things like that. But what he should do, record something, get an album done even. Drop a new single, and then gauge the reaction to that single. Now, I think Jon could probably put out his own album himself, especially with his experience and the fact that you have all these streaming services. He definitely still has a platform, still has a following. Most of the reaction to that discussion was all positive. Even people that were mad at him 4 years ago were saying, we want another Iced Earth album. What's done is done. I think most people have forgiven him. Christian brought up in the discussion that, the people that are complaining the most about this or the loudest are the squeaky wheel, and it's a much smaller portion of people than we think. I agree. If we would have had that discussion 3 years ago, would have been a little bit different. But as they say, time heals all wounds, and most people are over it at this point, and they want to hear a new Iced Earth album, hear new material. And I think that's going to be coming at some point. I don't know how soon. It could be a month from now. It could be 2 years from now. Who knows? But I think the guy should create, record, and make an album. And out of nowhere, no press releases, nothing, just drop a single. Just put a single out. And watch how people react to it. What's interesting, and I was thinking about this today. When Jon was pardoned, and when he had the lawsuit dropped, pretty much almost no metal media outlet talked about it. Now, Jon put a statement out talking about how he was regretful for what he did. I think that statement is sincere. He talked about the bad position he put his bandmates in. I agree with that. And he acknowledged that and realizes that was a bad decision on his part. I think he took accountability for it. And the judge in the case also said that it was nice to see the fact that Jon did take accountability for it, and that it said a lot about his character and a lot about him as a person. But one of the things in that statement that he said, I'm talking about Jon now, he was talking about watching his name get dragged through the mud for 4 years. And as I said in my original episode and in a discussion, I did not want to talk about Jon because he's pretty much been muted for the most part. He had no way of really saying anything to defend himself. And it was not fair for me to criticize him or praise him or whatnot until he put out an actual statement himself, which he did through his lawyers. But one of the things he put out is the media dragging his name through the mud. Folks, there have been some very disgusting things said about this dude in a lot of these articles. All of these metal media outlets were completely bashing this guy at some point. Maybe not all, but most of them. Folks, did you notice that after that statement, not one of these media outlets has said anything about Jon getting pardoned or about his lawsuit being dropped? They were all about dragging the dude's name through the mud, and then now it's crickets. I find that interesting. His statement, I believe, came out at the end of October 2024. These outlets put articles out about the statement. Some of those articles were trashing him And then suddenly, miraculously, you don't hear anything about the guy now. You didn't hear anything about the pardon. You don't hear anything about his lawsuit being dropped recently. Folks, I can give you 2 reasons for that. And this just goes to show the lack of integrity some of these journalists actually have. One, they realize that if they start trashing this guy or continue to do what they've done, they probably open themselves up to some liability. Because a lot of the stuff said about this dude was pretty unfair, in my opinion, and pretty stupid, to be honest. Number 2, they know that with a pardon and a lawsuit being dropped, Jon Schaffer is going to be able to have a career again. And they are oddly quiet because these websites know they are going to have to do a lot of ass kissing to get this man to come on their show. And a lot of these outlets that have been bashing him are probably salivating at the fact that they want to ask this guy a lot of loaded questions, a lot of things that mainstream media would actually do to politicians, right? And again, I can only speculate. I don't know what goes through the minds of these people, but if you notice, I find it odd that they have not said anything about this man since the election. Figured I would throw that out there. Now, one last thing before I go into break. Where is this man? How do I think Iced Earth is going to be received worldwide? I think anything in Latin America, South America is fair game. I don't think he's going to have a problem. And as Christian said in the discussion, if anything, he will probably have more people going to see Iced Earth because he's been gone for so long. I don't think Europe will be as hostile towards him as people think. I mean, I think they will. I mean, he'll have some pushback there, but I don't think it's going to be as bad. And the reason being is that most people in Europe, I think, they care more about the music than the politics, I think, at this point, you know, as far as a band like Iced Earth goes. Now, you're going to have people that hate him because everybody in Europe hates Trump, but people are just going to want to see the band live. And European people, as much as some of the people on the right that I'm really good friends with, you know, talk about them hating Trump and all this stuff, I think that people from Europe, at least in my experience, have always been, I said this before, they've always been more respectful in having political discussions with than anybody here. So I don't think he will have as hard of a time getting a gig over there as people think. And I don't think the United States is going to be bad. You know, folks, Christian said this, and I agree with him 100%. The squeaky wheels make the most noise. And to give you guys the analogy, to tell you what that means, if you don't know, let's say you have 1,000 shopping carts. Each one has 4 wheels. So you have 4,000 wheels. You might have 2 wheels that squeak out of those 4,000 wheels on all of those shopping carts. And they're going to make the most noise over the other 3,998 wheels that are in where all of those shopping carts are at. I don't think he's going to have an issue. I think he will be much more well received than people think. And if people are going out to see a guy like Tim Lambesis, who hired a hitman to get rid of his wife, and that band is playing festivals, I know his whole band quit recently, and that band's playing shows, I don't think the reaction to Jon is going to be as rough as people think it is. I could be wrong, but I don't think that's going to be the case. Will the insurrection thing come up? The protest? Yeah. It's always going to come up in comments, things like that. But realistically, I think he will be able to at some point resurrect his career to where it was before, or at least pretty close. Anyhow, I want to thank everybody for the reactions. I want to thank Metal Rose from the Podcast of the Wicked. I'm going to put that podcast link in the show notes. And again, she has done an excellent job at covering this, at following Jon's lawsuits. Hands down, it's nice to see Jon has a supporter like that out there in the scene. And I'm sure there are a lot of other people, and there's a lot of other people that support him. I think most people in general they don't really give a shit about politics in this point. They just want to see the band live. A lot of people are going to hail him as a patriot. I get it. You're going to have people that are going to call him a terrorist, but I think the middle ground of people that don't really care about politics and just want to see iced earth, that is going to be the biggest and largest percent of people out there that are going to be going to these shows. So with that said, I'm going to go into break. When I come back, I'm going to talk about the new Jack Starr album called Out of the Darkness Part 2, and I'm going to revisit one of my favorite albums of all time, Grip Inc. with The Power of Inner Strength. I'll be right back after this. Hey everybody, it's Tony here from the Metal Command Podcast. I appreciate you watching this program, and if you want to see more of what I offer on this show, please by all means hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video, follow me on any other social media outlet that you see this program, and again, I appreciate all of your support. To the Metal Command Podcast, Tony here with you. Now let's talk about Jack Starr. One of my favorite people in the scene, a fantastic guitar player. Recently had him on the show for an interview. Many of you saw that interview. Jack is a really cool dude, a really fun guy to talk to, and probably one of the most versatile guitar players I have ever heard. The man can play, the guy actually can play some really great blues guitar. He's a really fantastic blues guitar player. Listening to some of the past projects he's been a part of, he can play thrash metal, as crazy as that might sound to some of you. But where he has excelled the best is classic American hard rock and American power metal. I think that's where his niche is. And his new album, Out of the Darkness Part 2, I think is excellent. So there are a couple interviews with Jack on my podcast. I have a couple older ones from, maybe 10, 11 years ago that I could put up there as well. We had some great interviews together over the years on my radio show. But this new album, Out of the Darkness Part 2, is pretty good. And I'm going to tell you why. First of all, it is a very diverse album. Most of Jack's albums are, usually power metal oriented, and this has some of that, but there's a lot of other types of heavy metal being played here. Like the very first song, Hand of Doom. I keep thinking of the Black Sabbath song. Maybe there was something behind that. It's great. It has like more of a Black Sabbath doom metal vibe. Rise Up is more of an anthemic, classic American hard rock song. That's the video. That was the first single they put out. But generally speaking, there's a lot of variety on this album. Now, the biggest compliment you can pay a record, one of the biggest compliments you can pay a record, is to say that after you hear one song, it leaves you wanting more. And that's what this album does. Interestingly enough, as you get into the album, it gets better as you get into it. I think the second half of the album is a little better than the first half. Even the bonus tracks on it are really, really good. But generally speaking, this is a pretty good record. Now, what helped make this album as good as it is? Jack's certainly a wonderful songwriter. He has always written great stuff. But one of the things that really, really made this album great was the fact he brought Giles Lavery in. Giles, of course, sings with Alcatraz, Warlord, and has a new album coming out with a band called Dragon's Claw. But Giles is a guy, as I've said before in this show, that has that classic American power metal voice. He's not from the States, but he has that kind of voice. But the other talent that he does have is the fact that he is great at writing vocal melodies. He's absolutely fantastic at that. And that was one of the things that I noticed, especially when it comes to the vocal harmonies on many of the songs on the album. So I brought this up to Jack Starr. I talked to him about Giles and what it was like working with him. And here's what Jack had to say. This is from the interview we just did. Check this out. You picked Giles Lavery. Giles is a really good dude. I've always liked him. I think his voice is like a perfect representation of, what power metal from the U.S. would sound like. And I know you spoke highly of him in the previous interview that we did. And what made you ask Giles to say, hey, you know what? Why don't you sing on this record?
Well, number one, I heard what he did with Alcatraz, which was brilliant. And then I also heard what he was doing with Warlord, recently. And again, that was great. So I'm thinking, Giles is the kind of singer that can really cover both bases. He can be like an epic, and he is an epic, metal singer along the lines of, like Jeff Tate and people like that. Or even my previous singer, Todd Michael Hall or Mike Torelli. He can do all that. He can hit the really stratospheric notes, but he can also do the other stuff. He can get gritty and give us, that Rhett Forrester in your face, kind of almost like Bon Scott, meets David Coverdale, but maybe a little bit more Bon Scott. And so he can do both. And I thought, this doesn't have to limit me if we did this album, with Giles, because if there are songs that are in one particular genre, he could nail that, and vice versa if we do something else.
Right.
So the key word was versatility.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that I think that he's always done a great job of, and he came on my show in that weird impromptu interview we did, the kind of last minute type thing. I talked about one of the things that I like about him is as a singer, he is able to take an idea or a melody and really kind of add something to it in any band he's ever been in. And I think he did a lot of that. When I heard, weirdly enough, I heard the single, but when I heard some of the other tracks, I was like, I could just feel that, and it really his voice and his way of doing things, I think, is a perfect match for your songwriting. And I think and I think that it really resonated really well with me. Just the way he helped place some of the vocal melodies that you had probably come up for him. And refined that. I think he did an outstanding job. And I think that is where there's a huge difference with him in the band, from that standpoint, as well as singing.
Yeah, definitely. You don't want to have somebody that just yeses you, everything is great, and you want someone that puts in an equal amount of creativity and ideas, and that's what Giles does. He kind of actually challenges you to think about some of your parts. And then, because he might come up with an alternative, which at first, it's like, oh, I don't want anybody messing with my baby. But then you listen to it and it's like, wait a minute, hey, he's onto something. So, yes. And that's what I like about Giles, the bottom line is the guy can sing, It's as simple as that. There's a lot of guys that have a lot of some of the prerequisites, like, they look good or they have good stage presence or they, I don't know, or whatever. Giles can do all of that and he can sing. So damn, what a concept.
Jack Starr talking about Giles Lavery, why he picked him to sing on this album, and of course, what it was like working with him. Now, I decided to ask Giles Lavery earlier in the year about the same exact thing. I said, Giles, I think you did a great job, putting the vocal melodies on this. And this is what Giles had to say when we did kind of our impromptu interview a while back. Check this out. So one of the things I just said on a episode of the podcast, when I heard the song that you did, and a little bit of a preview of some of the other songs on the album, I noticed one thing that was a difference between this record and a lot of the other records he's done, even the last one, and I've noticed this in Warlord because I own all the Warlord albums. You came in And I think that you have always had this talent for coming up with really, really good vocal melodies on the top of these songs.
Oh,
it's like you kind of take that to a different level than most people would. Now, I also said that I think Jack Starr is like one of the like perfect, or as I call it, he's like one of the gold standard examples of what American power metal would sound like. And I told you this in a message that you are like perfect for that kind of music. And when I heard this, it was, I expected this to be really good. I was shocked that it's up, probably has gone up another level from that.
Wow.
I think, and I really say that because I think that you two together, as musicians, I think you just fit so well together. Just much like you fit with like Bill Samos's writing with Warlord. So a lot of the stuff on the last Warlord album, that was one of the things that I noticed about that. And I noticed that with you and Jack Starr as well. But when you sing, your singing voice is really just suited to this kind of American style power metal. And this is my initial reaction. But like I said, I was like, damn, I told you, I'm like, man, I want to like listen to more of this, right? So I think that you two make a really, really great team together. And, those were my initial thoughts. And I figured I'll let you respond from there.
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for the kind words and the compliment. And I just plugged my phone in because I realized I was down to 10%, so I'm hoping that's charging. But yeah, just to reference what you said, first of all, thank you. And the vocal melodies, I grew up with bands like Foreigner and Survivor, Journey, every bit as much as I grew up with Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, who also had great melodies and hooks and choruses and interesting vocal parts and putting a high octave with a lower octave to create that, like what Halford would do, a lot. And
yeah,
and harmony vocals and just dropping a harmony in on a line in a verse can make it just sound so much more interesting than just singing it straight through. So I've always been very conscious of that, to try and whether I succeed or fail from one song to the next, my effort that I put forth, my goal rather, is every word that I sing, every word, I try and make it sound interesting.
Correct.
Like if I sing the, do, go, this, that, I at least try and make it sound like a good that, or a good this, or a good, I don't want any kind of filler takes where, you hear a lot of records where certain words in a line haven't been given that attention and certain words have. I try and make sure every word, at least if you were to isolate that word, has a certain element of conviction, character, color, tone, or uniqueness to it, so that when you put it all together, it's even if you didn't like it, at least it's interesting, if you know what I mean. So keeping in mind, I also hooks, melodies, or something memorable, and something when you're doing a session, when you're singing someone else's material, you are obviously limited in a lot of ways to the way they want it sung. At least make it sound like there's a certain amount of conviction or interest on the part of the singer. But Jack was actually very... He said, look, just change a few words if you have to. Because guitar players generally can't write for singers. They put too many words in, a lot of the time. They put way too many words in, and you lose that melody because you need... It's like a guitarist sometimes put too many notes in. If you have a chorus where you have the big balloon chords, the big da, 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 the singer can go any place. But if you've got da, 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 you've pretty much got no choice but just to follow that. So it's the same with words. If there's too many words, you can't structure a melody. So Jack said, hey, modify the words, modify the line, modify the melody if you want. Do something if you feel like you can, if you feel like you can improve it. And in some cases, I felt I could. In other cases, I thought what Jack had done was ideal.
Right.
So that's where the collaboration came from, I think. He wrote the lyrics and he wrote the music, but he left that door open for me to change the cadence, the melody, the phrasing, et cetera, et cetera. So I was grateful for that, because it can be a bit of a drag when you get Melody Mike, who goes, don't change my, I've had some sessions where it's like, don't change my melody, don't change the cadence, don't change the phrasing. And well, then you should just sing it, because I'm my own singer and I'm unique, because every singer is unique unto themselves. It doesn't matter whether it's a death metal band or whatever.
Yeah.
Every vocalist is unique. And just to totally do a carbon copy of someone else's performance, it's really, I find that some people are very good at that, and it's a real gift, but I find it really hard. I need to have that freedom to, put my own thing into it. And Jack allowed me to do that. And for that, I was very grateful.
Yeah. I think you just have a vision for that. I mean, it's, I guess if you're not a musician, it's hard to explain it, but you just have a vision of almost like, and you're a big music fan, like I am. And the way I've always approached that is, what would I want to hear if someone, if I were somebody listening to this record, right? But you have a very good vision as to where, you talked about each word having its own conviction. You're very good about placing that word and that melody and that note right where it needs to be. And I think like I said, the combination of you and Jack with this music, I think is outstanding. And I was a little bit blown away by that, actually.
Oh, wow.
Because his songwriting, which I've always liked, and I think you, in placing your vocal melodies where they are, I just think it just works. I think the album's going to probably be received better than you probably think it will. Let's put it that way.
Well, I mean, and you never know, because sometimes you do what you think's an amazing record, and people go, yeah, that's nice, that's cool, yeah, that's all right. And then other times you do a record that you just think, oh, well, we got to the end of that one, okay, and then people love it.
Yeah.
Again, it comes from sort of different places as well. I mean, soul music is very vocal. I mean, that's very vocal orientated, with certain lines and words become, an intrinsic part of the rhythm and the feel of everything. And theater, if you go to see a theater production,
right,
it's very important in that sense as well. And I like to listen to different singers and different types of music. So there's probably all sorts of stuff kind of floating around up here, and it comes out here, sure. And that, and some of it may be instinctive, some of it may just be a homogenization of, all kinds of different things, that I've picked up over the years. I tend to say usually we owe it all to Lou Gramm, and if you spoke to him, he'd probably say he owes it all to Sam Cooke or Paul Rodgers or whoever his influences are. So,
sure,
it's, we're all kind of this amalgamation of, things we've picked up over the years. But that's the things I look out for. It's just to make things sound interesting. It doesn't have to be completely, totally original. At least it has to be interesting.
Giles talking about Jack Starr and working with him, and me asking him that same thing I asked Jack. I said about him being great with a lot of the vocal melodies and really being able to come up with great vocal melodies for this album. So some of my favorite songs off the album, A Night Has a Thousand Eyes. I think that is actually probably my favorite song on the album. The album after it, song after it, Sahara Winds, I think is an awesome song. A Hand of Doom, the first song, I think is awesome. The one bonus track, I have to go look at the name of it really quick. Savage at the Gate. That song is incredible. And then, of course, you have the single called Rise Up. A really great anthemic styled song. And what I did was I asked Jack, I said, Jack, what did you write this song about? And here's what he had to say. Check this out. The first single called Rise Up. Let's talk a little bit about that. What is that song about? Like, I mean, because I know Giles referred to you as somebody writing, the lyrics to, the songs on the record. And what was that song about? And why did you pick that as the first single?
Well, I felt that song makes a statement, to people to not be complacent and to not always follow orders, So they need to make their voices heard.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a call for people, it's not Street Fighting Man 40 years later. It's basically telling people, hey, think for yourself. We have a very strong mass media in America, and it pushes very hard for people to comply and think a certain way. And I think in heavy metal and in rock, it gives people an alternative. It's like when you listen to this subculture, which it is, because it's not, Barry Manilow, and it's not winning Grammy Awards or Lady Gaga or whoever's. I don't even know who these people are, to be honest with you. I think so. I don't know who they are, but whoever they are, and I wish them all the best. This is an alternative culture,
mm-hmm.
and I'm just saying, I want to be part of that, and I think it's a beautiful thing. And rise up, make your voice heard. You don't have to. You don't have to be, part of the sheep, or the sheeple or whatever, So that's what that song is about. And, in the lyrics, rise up, make a stand, it's really about that,
And that is where Jack talks about the first single from the album. Again, really great record. Giving it a rating out of 10. I give it a 9 out of 10. It's definitely very good. I like it better than the last Jack Starr's Burning Star album that came out not long ago. But very, very good record. Production sounds very good. And of course, it's coming out on Brave Words Records, which has a great team of people behind it. So definitely a really tremendously awesome record. And again, 9 out of 10 from me. I think the album's great. There'll be a link in the show notes to pre-order the album and a link to the song Rise Up. Grip Inc. Grip Inc. for me, the album The Power of Inner Strength is one of the greatest heavy metal albums I have ever heard. And I remember distinctly getting into this album when it came out back in 1995. The reason I'm bringing this up, the album came out 30 years ago this year, just celebrated its 30-year anniversary. But I grew up with this album. This was one of my favorite albums in high school. And just imagine being a kid during the grunge era getting into heavy metal music. It was definitely a different time back then. But Grip Inc. is the band that Dave Lombardo formed or helped form after he was out of Slayer the first time. And I remember this distinctly because back in those days, you didn't have you didn't really have the internet the way it is now. And you didn't have social media. And the only way you really ended up getting news about any heavy metal bands, because most metal bands, heavy metal was kind of a dead thing in the United States, was that you had Metal Edge magazine, and they would have news blurbs in the magazine. And I used to have a subscription to it as a teenager. And I remember reading this blurb that Dave Lombardo joined a new band called Grip Inc. Now, at the time, I was, and still disappointed in the album Divine Intervention by Slayer. I didn't think it was very good. I thought the production was bad. And I think even Kerry King has talked about the mix being bad in the album. Paul Bostaff was a very good drummer, but he wasn't Dave. And the band sounded different. I didn't like it. I was extremely disappointed in the fact Dave Lombardo was no longer in Slayer. And this is coming off the fact that I loved Seasons in the Abyss. And I had the double live album that had come out at that time, Decade of Aggression. And I loved Slayer, especially early Slayer back then. I still do like their stuff, actually. Slayer's been a band that's been kind of hit or miss since Seasons, but I didn't like Divine Intervention. That's kind of the point of the story. So I heard about Grip Inc., and I was eagerly awaiting to hear something else. But again, getting news on a lot of these bands was not easy to do. So one day, and this is back in the days when you had a lot of small brick and mortar music stores, because the only way you could hear any bands was physical product, right? There was a place called Perry's Rock Pile here in Cleveland. Now, if you've ever been there, if you're from the Cleveland, Ohio area and you've been there, Perry's is a place you will never forget. But the cool thing about it is that I went in there so often. He knew who I was back then. He knew what kind of music I listened to. He had a lot of really cool t-shirts. Like, I would walk in there, and this is what I miss about old school music stores, is that I walked in, he'd say hi, hey, I got a t-shirt from this band I know you like over there. I have some new releases you might be interested in, et cetera, et cetera. Well, one of the things Perry used to do when I would go in there, and this is something that a lot of record labels would do, especially smaller metal labels, like Metal Blade and Earache used to do this a lot, where they would print up and press a bunch of compilation CDs in like a cardboard sleeve, and they would send them off to radio stations maybe, or especially they would send them off to music stores. And he did one of two things with them. You played that music when people would walk in. Let's say, for example, somebody knew that I liked a certain band. Hey, I have a new song by that band. Check it out. And they had a lot of material from either albums that had just come out or albums that were going to come out that year. And he handed me this compilation CD from Metal Blade. Yeah, you'll like most of the stuff on here. And I looked and I saw Grip Inc. listed on there. And I saw a song called Ostracized. That was the actual song on that compilation from The Power of Inner Strength. I was excited when I saw this. I'm like, finally, I'm going to be able to listen to Grip Inc. So I get in my car. I had one of those old school portable CD players with the tape adapter to it. Pop the CD in, go to, I think it was track 8. I could be wrong, but it was one of the songs later on in the compilation. And I listened to it. I immediately turned my car right around, go back to Perry's Rock Pile, that music store I was just telling you about, and I pre-ordered the album, handed them the $15 for it. And that was a very typical thing to do as well, because what would happen is you'd pre-order it, they would get a whole shipment of CDs in, and the day of the release, you showed up, you picked it up, or he would call you. Some of these places would call you to say, hey, your CD's here, go pick it up. You know, there was no Amazon. You had some small mail order shops, but there was no Amazon. You didn't have any of these online websites where you can go shopping. You know, the way that a lot of smaller labels used to promote stuff. Again, you either had the listening station in the music store where they had a CD from that label. You could put headphones on and you could listen to whatever tracks you wanted to listen to from some of your favorite artists. Or they had just tons of these promo compilations they would hand out to music stores, and they would give them to people that listened to whatever genre of music that was. And that's how I learned about Grip Inc. Now, when I heard Grip Inc., I heard that song, I was immediately excited. But when I ended up getting the album, I was even more blown away. Because I listened to the first, couple tracks, the intro and the first song on the album. Then I heard the song Hostage to Heaven. And then I think it was the song Innate Affliction as well. Hostage to Heaven kind of reminded me of stuff that Dave Lombardo probably would have done in Slayer. Innate Affliction had a really, really strong Neurosis influence on it, actually. But the album is one of the heaviest and most incredible records I think I have ever heard. The song Monster Among Us was absolutely, it's still probably my favorite song in the album. But this is a record, and Grip Inc. was a band that was so unique. And what made it unique was basically the combination of musicians that played on those albums. Gus Chambers, his vocals were so different from anybody that I've ever actually heard. And part of the reason the band disbanded, sadly, is that Gus Chambers passed away. And there really is nobody out there that could sound like him or really, could duplicate his kind of vocals. I mean, he was part of what made that band really, really unique. So Power of Inner Strength, to me, still, to this day, is one of the most incredible albums I've ever heard. And it came very close to matching how good this record is with the album Solidify, which I thought was a very close second place. Nemesis is a good record. They're all good. Incorporated is probably my least favorite. That was the last one that came out. But Power of Inner Strength is just... And I think part of it is the diversity of the influences on the album and the different types of musicians on it. Not to mention the fact that these albums sounded flat out amazing. But I ended up having Dave Lombardo on the show. when Solidify came out. That album came out around when I started the radio show. And I actually met those guys at Harpo's. It's a small club in Detroit. And I remember when I first saw Gus Chambers, he was one of the more intimidating people I think I've ever seen. And if I hadn't interviewed him before, and I just saw that dude randomly on the street, he's definitely not a dude that you'd want to mess with. Like, I would be kind of like, okay, this guy's going to like kick my ass or something, because he was a pretty intense dude, but he was super nice. Really cool dude. It's sad that he's not with us anymore. But Grip Inc. for me is definitely one of my favorite bands of all time, and definitely a band that I wish would have put out more albums. Unfortunately, we only have 4. The band was not around very long, but I will say this to this day, and I will continue to say this because people get mad at me when I say this, but for me, Grip Inc.'s the best band I think Dave Lombardo ever played in. From the standpoint that it's such a diverse band with diverse influences. As much as I like Slayer, I Grip Inc., especially this album, I think it's the best album Dave Lombardo's ever played on. I know a lot of people will give me a lot of flack, and 95% of you will give me a lot of shit for that, but nevertheless, this is an album that had a huge influence on me, and during the 90s, I remember listening to this album non-stop in the car. I used to get mad because the tape adapter would pop out sometimes. You know, they would go bad after a while as well, but I could still go and listen to that album. I still enjoy it, and it is still one of the most incredible albums I've ever heard. So if you've never heard this record, I'm going to put a link to one of the songs off of the album as well. Check it out. If you've never heard it, it's a good album, The Power of Inner Strength by Grip Inc. And that's all I have for the Metal Command show today. If you like what you see and hear on this podcast, by all means, folks, hit the subscribe button, hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video. And if you follow this show on any other form of social media, by all means, give the show a like and a follow there. Thanks for watching. Stay metal.